like me now? Now that I'm on my way, you still think I'm crazy, standing here today. I couldn't make you love me, but I always dreamed about living in your radio. How do you like me now?
On February 5th, 2024, Toby Keith, the country singer whose silky smooth baritone voice, coupled with melodies and lyrics that celebrated American patriotism and blue-collar values, made him one of the most successful country music artists of all time, died after a long battle with stomach cancer. Keith, like so many others who are stricken with the disease, suffered with stomach problems for years without any idea of the nature or severity of his illness, only to be diagnosed after it was too late. Keith first went public with his diagnosis in June of 2022 in an Instagram message about the difficulties he'd faced and the uncertain road ahead, but also projected optimism for the future. He wrote, quote, "Last fall I was diagnosed with stomach cancer. I've spent the last 6 months receiving chemo, radiation, and surgery. So far so good. I need time to breathe, recover, and relax. I am looking forward to spending the time with my family, that I will see the fans sooner rather than later. I can't wait." For the next 15 months, Keith retreated to his house in Norman, Oklahoma, where he received his cancer treatments and brought all of his strength to bear against the notoriously painful form of the disease. Keith had generational ties to the area, and though the house in which he now lived was as massive as you'd expect from a musician of his star status, it was also just a stone's throw from the modest home in which he grew up and where his mom still lived. And it was here that he chose to fight the cancer battle, saying, quote, "This is where I was raised. This is where I come home to. I can go anywhere in the world I want to go, but this is where I choose to be." Keith's battle appeared to pay off, and by the fall of 2023, his cancer was believed to be in remission. After over a year in seclusion, he returned to the limelight at the People's Choice Country Awards in September 2023, where he was introduced to a standing ovation. He walked slowly to the microphone. There was a frailty to him, and he was exceptionally thin, a noticeable change from the once muscular, barrel-chested man who used to bound onto stages and roar into mics. But as the lights dimmed and Keith began to play the poignant "Don't Let the Old Man In," a ballad he'd written a few years before about an aging man's confrontation with his own mortality, the magic returned and his voice was as strong and as beautiful as it has ever been.
Don't let the old man in. I wanna live me some more. Can't leave it up to him. He's knocking on my door. And I knew all of my life that someday it would end. Get up and go outside. Don't let the old man in.
The performance brought the house to tears, and Keith's comeback was the story in country music. He planned to stay active and played a number of gigs throughout the fall and into December, culminating with 3 nights of sold-out shows at the Park MGM in Las Vegas before he returned to Oklahoma for the holidays. But in January, the cancer returned, and this time, exhausted from fighting, Keith opted to accept his fate. He leaned into his faith, comparing his battle against cancer to a long walk down a dark hallway and saying it was only his deep and abiding belief in God that got him through. He was not scared, he said, because he had obtained a peace that passes all understanding. On the morning of February 5th, 2024, with his family by his side, he passed away in his sleep. Toby Keith was 62 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is Last Days, Toby Keith.
In the wake of Toby Keith's death, tributes came from all corners. They came from people who you might expect would honor a country music star from rural Oklahoma whose lyrics often centered on themes of American pride and working-class hardships like Jason Aldean, Morgan Wallen, Luke Combs, and even Donald Trump, who bestowed Keith with the National Medal of Arts in 2021 during a White House ceremony. And they also came from Carrie Underwood, who credited Toby Keith as one of the people who inspired her career, who gave him the countryest of all possible country send-offs, saying, quote, "Saddle up the horses, Jesus, 'cause a true blue cowboy just made his ride up to heaven. Introduce him to all the Okies and sign that boy up for choir. We're going to miss you, Toby, but my heart has no doubt that you are standing in the presence of our king right now. See you again someday, friend." But tributes to Keith also came from many people who you might find surprising, like Barack Obama and First Lady Jill Biden, both of whom forged personal friendships with Keith. And most of all from comedian and professed liberal Stephen Colbert, who developed an unlikely and lasting friendship with the singer after he appeared on Colbert's show in 2015. Keith would go on to appear on Colbert's show 6 more times, and the two were frequent dinner companions. Colbert compared the reaction many people had when they saw the two men together to the excitement we get when we see a video on the internet of a friendship between a horse and a duck. Colbert concluded the joke by pointing out the obvious. Toby was the horse and Colbert was the duck. The two became so close, in fact, that Keith gifted Colbert with one of his favorite guitars and honored Colbert by asking him to induct Keith into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. On the day Keith died, Colbert devoted a segment of his show to the singer, noting that although they came from very different places and had differing views on many issues, he loved him for his intellect and his open-mindedness.
Because I was lucky enough to become friends with Toby over the years, as improbable as that seems. We met very early on the Colbert Report. That day, Toby taught me not to prejudge a guest and to have my intention, but to keep my eyes open to the reality of who they are. And for that lesson, and for a lot of other things, I'm always going to be grateful.
Indeed, it was easy to typecast Toby Keith. His image as a rough-and-tumble cowboy with a penchant for trucks, beer, and country living aligned him with a particular stereotype, and his upbringing in rural Oklahoma inspired songs that connected him with the culture and experiences of working-class Americans. In much of his music, Keith adopted an in-your-face country persona, and in his early hits, like 1993's Should Have Been a Cowboy and 99's How Do You Like Me Now, he focused on common country themes of blue-collar, small-town life. But offstage, Toby Keith was so much more than the stereotypes that permeated his music. This was a side of Keith that Stephen Colbert saw. He was deeply thoughtful, an intellectual who was critical of the undercurrent of bigotry and extremism that sometimes, though by no means always, plagues country music and its performers and fans. Keith openly advocated for equality and against racism. He had nuanced views on gun control and abortion that sought to both adhere to the traditional Southern values with which he'd grown up, while simultaneously acknowledging and accepting the realities of the modern world. I really, Derek, find this fascinating. I think he's one of a kind. We've forgotten in the modern world this idea that somebody who appeals to a certain fan base can be so tempered in their political. It wasn't that he avoided the political issues. He addressed them head on. He addressed abortion, gun control, gay rights, issues of racism in country music generally. He addressed them head on. He would answer the questions when asked, and he didn't avoid them.
I completely agree. I confess, Jason, Toby Keith to me is a figure who I came to be very aware of after 9/11.
Yep.
And I came to be aware of him as an ally of a George W. Bush view of the world. He had a lot of big songs during that era. And so when I hear that he had a close relationship with Stephen Colbert, it makes me think of him as maybe one of the most misunderstood country music stars in history, because it sounds like he was actually very, very nuanced on these issues. But I think a vast majority of the people who think of Toby Keith think of him as a red, white, and blue country boy and with sort of anachronistic values.
And he is a red, white, and blue country boy. And we'll talk about this quite a bit. It's hard to pin him down, but he was also, he went on 60 Minutes back just after he was, we'll talk about the 2001 song about the war. And he went on 60 Minutes and he addressed these issues in a very nuanced, as you said, and profound way. In the ideas of a thinking man. He was not particularly well educated. He'd gone to high school in Oklahoma, wanted to become a professional football player, had tried out for the Oklahoma Outlaws and some other semi-professional teams, and then went and worked on oil derricks as he was sort of trying to build up his musical repertoire.
So he had real country bona fides.
He had real country bona fides, blue collar. This is not a college-educated guy, but nevertheless, and if you hear him talk, you're not going to mistake him for sort of an erudite Harvard grad, right? But if you hear him talk, this is a man who's very bright, who is very thoughtful, who thinks about things not from the most obvious perspective of those who might be around him. You can imagine sort of the political tilt of people on the oil derricks of Oklahoma.
Sure.
That was not who he was. Not to say that his politics necessarily always diverged from them, but he thought through every issue very deeply and then went very publicly. He's one of the most famous country musicians in the world after a time, and talked about them very openly.
Yeah, look, it's not as if he sort of cast aside Southern Republicans who might have enjoyed his music. It's just that he was deeper than that. And maybe when he was grabbed and co-opted in certain moments, he wasn't out there saying, that's not me, but he also wasn't embracing all of the nastiness and the bigotry that might have attended some of those things. He was different than that, and I found that very, very enlightening. And Toby Keith was by no means a fence-sitter on every issue, especially when it came to patriotism. Keith was fond of saying that he came from 3 generations of men who had served the United States in war, including his father, who had lost an eye while serving in Korea. And nowhere did Keith make that patriotism more clear than in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, when he was inspired to write what would become his defining hit, a song called Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. The unapologetically patriotic anthem, which Keith subtitled The Angry American, offered a fierce defense of American values and established Keith as the preeminent face of American outrage after the attacks.
Now this nation that I love is falling under attack. A mighty sucker punch came flying in from somewhere in the back. Soon as we could see clearly through our big black eye, man, we lit up your world like the 4th of July.
The song's raw emotion and unfiltered expression of anger and defiance struck a chord with listeners, making it an anthem for many in the post-9/11 generation. Keith was invited to perform for troops overseas, and the song made him a favorite of President George W. Bush, who adopted the song as a rallying cry to muster support for the war efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Keith, though a lifelong Southern Democrat who'd supported Bill Clinton, became a full-throated supporter of Bush and the American war effort. Unsurprisingly, given the nature of the song and the impassioned times in which he wrote it, the song generated controversy and criticism rained down on Keith from many on the left who considered it a tasteless glorification of war. Dixie Chicks frontwoman Natalie Maines was particularly critical, labeling the song ignorant, and said it, quote, makes country music sound ignorant. Here he is in a 2018 interview with Dan Rather recalling his initial reaction to this criticism.
And I write Courtesy Red, White, and Blue thinking Charlie Daniels did it, John Wayne did it, Patriots love this, and it blows up in my face. And all of a sudden I got Hollywood and my music industry coming at me, and I'm pretty green at the time, and I don't know how to respond.
Keith was obviously deeply hurt by the criticism, and it elicited in him a resentment for his critics he'd never experienced before. He said it caused him to wonder aloud how it was that it was suddenly wrong for a singer to offer support for the military wherever they are in the world.
It's interesting. He references back to old crooners and comedians. Bob Hope, for example. He talks about John Wayne, other singers who they would always travel, whether it was the Korean War or the Vietnam War, or certainly World Wars II and I. They would travel overseas. They would talk to the troops, and there was never criticism leveled against them. And he feels that, and he was at this point where he wrote this song that was very defensive of the troops, very aggro against the enemy. And he was stunned, almost naively, I think, a little bit, stunned by the criticism that was leveled at him.
That's the thing that's interesting to me, because certainly Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue opened up a vein of Islamophobia in the country that was starting to gush. When George W. Bush, to his credit, always said this isn't a war about Muslims, but it was beginning to become a situation of strange bedfellows. The people who were the angriest Americans, who were they angry at? You want to have a motivation for who is the enemy. And the enemy was positioned as Muslims. And so Toby Keith, by writing a song and subtitling it The Angry American, was positioning the enemy as othering Muslims who had attacked during 9/11.
And that's a little unfair. Your point is right. That's the way it was perceived. It's a little unfair to the song. The song is very much about these people, I didn't mean to say these people. People came over from overseas and attacked us, and we are going overseas, and we are going to rain hellfire down on them. It's sort of taken from the song. He never called for discrimination against American-born Muslims, Muslims living here, peace-loving people around the world, never called for that at all. But you're right. It was co-opted by, it was a very impassioned time, right? And it was co-opted by people who said, here can be our rallying cry, our clearing call, whatever it is, to get people motivated behind this. And they exploited that for their benefit. Toby Keith never stood in the way of that.
And to your point, I take him at his word. Maybe there was a bit of naivete. Maybe this was pure patriotism. He is a blue-collar guy who worked on oil rigs, and maybe he didn't have sort of the hatred. And I do. I actually think there was a sincerity that he was surprised by the reaction and who took the song and made it into maybe a sort of nastier political message. And he said that 6 days after the song's release, he went ahead and changed his political party affiliation to independent. And then he went in hard on Natalie Maines, who was from the Dixie Chicks. He made fun of her intellect and her songwriting ability and began displaying a backdrop at his concerts of a doctored photo of Maines with Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. So that's when he sort of leaned in a bit and said, these liberal namby-pambies, they're in bed with the bad guys.
He said, I'm no longer a Democrat. I'm now an independent. He talked about how his father was a Democrat, his grandfather before that, obviously Southern Democrat. All Southerners were Democrats once upon a time, very different alignment. But he said, I can no longer be aligned with this group of people who are attacking me simply for patriotism.
Yeah, he said that if that's where the Democrats are, I'm out of the Democratic Party. But interestingly, went to become an independent.
Yes.
Didn't join the Republicans.
Right, exactly.
So the spat escalated at the Academy of Country Music Awards in May 2003, where both of the artists were up for Entertainer of the Year. Though Keith took home the prize, Maines made headlines when she wore a T-shirt with the acronym FUTK on it, a not-so-subtle shot at her new rival. It was an ugly episode spurred on by zealous fans on both sides, and Keith later expressed regret over it. He said in an interview that he was embarrassed by the way he let himself get sucked into the controversy, noting, quote, "I probably disappointed myself more than anything, because I'm better than that. Got pretty vicious sometimes, putting her and Saddam Hussein up on the screen. That was funny for a night or two, and then it was a little over the top for me. I'm not that mean."
It does not appear that Natalie Maines ever reconsidered her criticism of Toby Keith. I couldn't find anything when I looked for it. But she obviously had bigger fish to fry, because just a couple of months later, during a concert that the Dixie Chicks had in London, she said that she was embarrassed or ashamed of her president, George W. Bush. And the criticism that came for her, the critics that came for her on both the right and frankly the left about speaking about our president like that while on foreign soil was not well received. And it completely upended her entire career. And that of
the Dixie Chicks were so massive
the biggest band in
before
country
this
music at that moment.
They were
Yes,
unbelievably big, and their career hit a hard stop during this incident. I remember this. I think now, she is positioned, this is 20 years later, as a sort of courageous voice against what she perceived to be bad things she really cared about in the administration. I think she's now looked at like a martyr. She martyred her career
among some, sure. Yes.
by a certain segment of the population. But in the moment, they lost everything. And Toby Keith was ascendant because he was with George W. Bush. There was a lot of enthusiasm in those early days for the efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he was part of that.
Yeah, I said a minute ago they were one of the biggest acts in country. I think that true country music fans would disagree with that. I can say that in terms of a crossover appeal, obviously Garth Brooks, nobody's ever been like Garth Brooks and Shania Twain, but Dixie Chicks were in that era, right? They were in that tier.
Landslide, Cowboy Take Me Away, Wide Open Spaces. They were massive crossover hits.
And so, instant with that criticism of George W. Bush, their careers ended basically. They've come back. They're successful.
They now call themselves the Chicks. They dropped the Dixie. So they've now leaned hard into, we're not really part of the Southern establishment of country music, and so they're moving in the direction of the liberals.
But at the same time, Toby Keith pays no price at all. He is more successful than ever, eventually amassing a fortune of $400 million.
Unbelievable. I mean, he was a massive,
to juxtapose
star.
that against what happened to the Dixie Chicks is pretty remarkable coming out of this spat. Anyway, the controversy surrounding Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue didn't do anything to hurt sales. The song sold 4 million copies in all and was an instant #1 hit, catapulting Keith into the top tier of country music stars, a position he would hold for the rest of his life. From 2003 forward, he would release an additional 19 albums yielding 26 top 10 hits, including 11 #1s. The biggest among them, Beer for My Horses, a duet with Willie Nelson, and As Good As I Once Was, the song dubbed Toby Keith's Piano Man, a thoughtful, though somewhat crass tale of a middle-aged man hoping to recapture his youth for just one night.
I ain't as good as I once was. I got a few years on me now. But there was a time back in my prime when I could really lay it down.
As Keith matured, his songwriting became more emotional and introspective, gone were the tales of women, whiskey, and war, in favor of more nuanced themes of peace and wisdom, happiness and loss. In his earlier years, Keith had often portrayed himself as a rugged individualist, unapologetic in his beliefs and unyielding in his convictions. However, as he aged, he matured. He penned songs like My List, a reflection on aging, loss, and the passage of time, and his 2007 hit, Love Me If You Can, which re-examined his emotions in the wake of the controversy around Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue.
It's interesting. This strikes me. There's a real arc to his career, because the Toby Keith I knew of before Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue was, have you ever heard You Ain't Much Fun Since I Quit Drinking? They were fun. They were real country songs. You would never call him modern. You would say maybe some of his views about women were a little retrograde, but he was not mean-spirited. And some of country can get in that direction, and he was always a sort of fun romp. Keith also spoke openly about his struggles and shortcomings, allowing his fans to see him as a fully realized human being rather than a larger-than-life figure. He acknowledged struggling with alcohol and admitting he'd done a stint in rehab in 2003. And he also talked openly about his politics, something that's brave for any artist in the modern age, but especially so for a country artist from the South who is anything but a strident conservative. Keith said he hoped people could honor their differences and respect his authenticity, and it seems he was right. Keith's sales never suffered, even as he expressed deep admiration for President Barack Obama and performed at his 2009 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance ceremony. He even gave Obama's speech a standing ovation, but in true Toby Keith style, he then risked angering the other side by performing at Donald Trump's 2017 inauguration, about which he said, quote, "I don't apologize for performing for our country or military. I performed at events for previous presidents Bush and Obama and over 200 shows in Iraq and Afghanistan for the USO. If the president of the frickin' United States asks you to do something and you can go, you should go."
Pretty incredible he can pull this off, right? I mean, we've talked about it now.
Talk about threading the needle.
Yeah, he really did. It's funny, though, he had this immense personal growth as a songwriter, as a person, coming out and admitting that he suffered from alcoholism, a big deal for him. But at the same time, he writes Red Solo Cup, which is one of, talk
It's
about
an
a
anthem.
fun romp. It was
Yeah.
actually his biggest crossover hit. It charted at number 15 on the Billboard 100 hit charts, not just the country charts. He's now in the Billboard 100s. He's sort of a little bit embarrassed. He acknowledged the song was not his best work, but boy.
But it's a joyous,
sold
good old boy
like
anthem.
crazy. It was
Absolutely.
really something else. But he was incredible in his ability to sort of play both worlds and really authentically. And I think that's what people liked about him. And it was just this type of authenticity that endeared him to so many folks. The authenticity showed through his expressions of respect for political leaders, regardless of their party, and in his deep-rooted friendship with a liberal comedian whose wit and candor Keith admired, and in his willingness to say he was sorry to a musical rival when he realized that he might have gone too far in his efforts to bring her down. But most of all, it was in his music, which when he was young focused on chasing women and rabble-rousing, then morphed into capturing his passionate feelings of patriotism during a time of war, and finally transitioning to heartfelt sentiments about love and loss, happiness and growing old, culminating in his last great song, Don't Let the Old Man In, his ultimate tribute to a life well lived. Stephen Colbert said he was forever grateful for his friendship with Toby Keith, and I'll leave the last word to him.
Toby was a great performer, unapologetically patriotic, opinionated, brash, often controversial, but resonating with legions of fans by writing their lives in a very real and entertaining way. I will issue this invitation to anybody. I do not care who you are. I will meet you at this place. I will meet you at being brokenhearted that Toby Keith is gone.